Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we're going to be covering another wonderful archetype from Divine Mysteries, another one based on a whole religious group. If you saw my last video on the Palatine Detective, which I realize now it's not Palantine, but Palatine, who cares? Whatever, I messed up, my bad. Anyway, you know that there are various groups that, while necessarily being divine, are not necessarily religious. And the Rivethun series of archetypes, yes, series of archetypes, are all based on such a group, a kind of spiritual group. So this is actually the first of 3 videos that will then result in a 4th final video with all the archetypes put together. So if you enjoy long form or short form content, then hopefully this pleases as many people as possible. That is my goal anyway. So if you're interested in watching them all at once, go ahead, click off the video now. I don't care. It will be ready in a few days at the very least. So, you know, take what you will. Some people will enjoy that, you know, a nice thing to listen to in the car. I'm sure it's going to be like an hour and a half long. I don't know. But for now, I'm just going to be doing them each in a segment. But with this segment, the first one, the Rivethun Emissary, I'm going to talk about the Rivethun religion, or at least religious group, spiritual group. Spiritual group, I think, is a better way to put it. So it's actually not that complicated. First of all, let's go ahead and show you what the order is all about if you decide to be a cleric or priest of this group. So you can, because it does count as a pantheon of sorts. It is a dwarvish based spiritual group, but it is not completely tied to dwarvish culture, but it is heavily rooted in dwarvish culture. So anyone can be a part of the Rivethun spiritual group. I'm going to say that rather than religion because that's more accurate to what it is. And it really is just a group that stems from animism, believing in the spirits and natural balance of things. And many members of the Rivethun spiritual group act as intermediaries, whether it's as a priest or a shaman or something of the like. And this is kind of the base of what used to be like the shamans from Pathfinder 1st edition, or at least some other root is in Rivethun, and it's very fascinating. Honestly, I do recommend checking this part of the book out if you decide to pick up Divine Mysteries for yourself, which, you know, I really would recommend. But all you need to know is that you are connected to spirits, whether they are like natural spirits, undead spirits, anything kind of supernatural. You're connecting that to, you know, mortals in a sense, and you kind of act as an intermediary. And so many of the Rivethun archetypes utilize that to add some kind of spiritual nature to your character. And today we're going to be talking about the Rivethun Emissary, which is particularly good at casting domain spells and has a familiar that can be quite good, and I would say almost key to this particular archetype. But before we get to that part, I need to let you guys know that Paizo did send me a copy of Divine Mysteries for the sake of review, but this is not paid content. They didn't pay me to make this video, so all thoughts and opinions here are my own. Though, if I'm going to shill for Into the AM. So Into the AM has provided me with a bunch of shirts at this point, and they're really nice. And I know some of you have already gone out and bought some shirts, and I just want to let you guys know that there is an insane deal going on between now and December 8th, where you can get up to 60% off on most things on their website. So if you want to get some really cool deals, you can go there. But I do recommend using my link down in the description below, because not only does that tell them that I sent you there, but you get an additional 10% off. So whatever your discount is, an additional 10% on top of that is really good. So if you want to get some really nice shirts, similar to the one showing in the ad up over here, I really recommend checking out. This is actually my favorite one, but unfortunately the graphic is on the back. So I'm going to show you guys real quick, and then we're going to get on with the video. Was that good? I don't know. It probably looked really weird, but I really like this is the Magical Brew shirt. So, you know, if you want the same one, It's Magical Brew. You can find it on their website. I really do like this one. I'm just sad that the cool graphic is on the back, but you know, what can you do? Anyway, let's go ahead and get on with the video finally. So, the Rivethun Emissary, what is it? I kind of already mentioned, but you get a major focus on domain spells and a familiar, but this one also has some nice magic abilities added on top and some very interesting roleplay potential. I would say the Rivethun Emissary is really good for any character that is already prone to using a familiar and you want to boost some of your magical abilities, kind of getting some divine spells on top of everything, or maybe even potentially a martial character who wants to diversify their kit a little bit by getting some good innate spells. There are some really good domain spells out there that can be really good for martial characters as well, so something to keep in mind. And you know what? Familiars are just really good, and they can be helpful for all kinds of characters. But let's go ahead and talk about the archetype itself. So there are actually two parts to this archetype, but let's go ahead and talk about the basic part. So when you must be associated with Rivethun, at least for access purposes. That is mostly a Pathfinder Society thing, so you don't need to worry about that. But this is also uncommon, and this is kind of one of the more valid uncommons I've seen amongst archetypes that Pathfinder gives, or Paizo gives out, and that's because this one revolves completely around entreating with spirits. Entreat, bond with spirit is what it's called, is kind of like a major thing in this, and so there's could be some major story implications for that, and a lot of this can be a little finicky and some of the wording can be a little weird. So I will say that the Emissary does have some pretty narrative parts to it that need to be addressed by the GM or completely written off. And we'll get to that here in just a moment. You also need to be trained in diplomacy and religion. And when you select this dedication, which is a level 2 dedication, you become expert in both religion and diplomacy. That's actually pretty big. Many archetypes out there give you 1 or 2 skill proficiencies, but not many of them make you expert, which is actually really good. Higher level proficiencies are somewhat hard to get in Pathfinder, and in a game that has such a tight window for getting skills for characters, I mean, once you get out of level like 7 and beyond, your number of max level skills gets smaller and smaller, unless of course you're a rogue or an investigator. So this is actually a pretty good feature. You also get the Bond with Spirits activity, and you gain a focus spell called Intreat Spirit. We'll get to the focus spell in a bit, but let's talk with Bond with Spirit, as this is kind of a more prominent part of the dedication. And before we get to that, any spell casting you get from this particular archetype, 1, you become trained in spell casting and spell DCs, and your spell casting for your Rivethun spells specifically uses wisdom as your key attribute. So that's something you very much want to keep in mind for those who, like me, like to dump their wisdom. So you want to have a pretty decent wisdom if you plan on using any of the domains that really rely on saves or attack rolls. I actually prefer a lot of the domains that just give buffs, because then you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. But anyway, on with Bond with Spirit. So Bond with Spirit is a very weird part of this. Now, the idea behind it is you bond with a spirit or the very land itself. And through this bond, you get essentially features through the rest of the archetype. At this point, it doesn't do much except for the focus spell Intreat with Spirit, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But the part of this I don't like is there's this strange wording, and it's towards the end here that says, you must be bonded with a spirit in order to entreat with spirit, or at least cast Intreat with Spirit. Anyway, so it is weird because the ability is called Bond with Spirit. And so this part could mean, linguistically speaking, you must have used your feature, or you must specifically be bonded with a creature. And an extra kicker here, when it's going through what the ability is about, nothing here states that the creature you need to bond with must be a spirit. But I would say many of the features after this point really don't work unless it's a spirit of some kind. And so this is the part that is weird. Now, narratively speaking, I understand that, like, maybe this is supposed to be a spirit, but if it's with the very land itself, aren't you communing with the spirit of the land? So, yeah, it's very strange. And the next feat we'll talk about might answer this to some degree, but even then it's dubious. This is just very strangely worded and not very well explained. Now, to some of you, it might be, but to me, and I'm sure to many out there, I'm pretty lost on the exact intent, at least as far as the words are concerned. I get, again, that this is about, entreating with a spirit or using a spirit specifically. But then when we talk about the practicality of that in a game, it gets a lot more muddy. Like, what if my friend, if a co-party member has a spirit type Eidolon, they're a summoner, can I bond with that Eidolon to get this benefit? Or is there a spirit of the land? Is that something we can commune with? What if I can't? Can I just, if there's no spirit in question available to me, is this not really a thing I can make use of? Other than, I guess, bonding with the land for potentially some of the other features? I don't know. There's a lot of wiggle room. And the Rivethun Emissary, I think, is, of these archetypes, the more narratively focused one. I think a lot of the oomph from this archetype comes from the kind of story you can tell with it. And I think a good GM can make this work out. But honestly, I think a very easy fix is if you just do it with the land itself, then you're bonding with the spirit, and it creates a very interesting element that I like, which is you're bonding with the spirit of the land, but it's not like a personification. It's just kind of like an ambiguous entity of the very area you're in, and that can have some interesting role-playing elements to it. Again, I've already stated before several times while going over this book, I'm not a fan of like personified spirits. I don't like it when otherworldly entities are just people. But to each their own. However it works in your game, I just want to make mention of that the wording here either is explicit to the point where it doesn't work most of the time, because, by the way, I actually didn't mention this, but you're only bonded with this creature for a day, and as long as you're within 1 mile of the entity in question. So you can't even bond with the spirit at like a city that you were recently at, because on your adventure, you're probably going to easily get 1 mile away. And it just like, it doesn't work mechanically for how these kind of games tend to work. So, I mean, I think just communing with the land itself should be sufficient. And it's an activity that just takes 10 minutes. So it's not really that big of a deal. And you can do it on your adventure. And when it says you're bonding with the spirit of the land itself, all you have to do is be within that land, within that terrain, in order to bond with it. So you don't even have to be sitting in one place. But if it's a creature specifically, then you need to be, close to the creature. So it's very interesting. And let's go ahead and talk about the focus spell before we get on to the rest of the archetype. So we have Intreat Spirit here. It is a singular action, and you can see here again that requirement that you must be bonded with a spirit. So again, that weird kind of terminology. If I am to believe what's being read here, it must be a spirit, in which case, does the land count as a spirit? I don't know. It's whatever. I've gone over this. So bonded with a spirit, what's it do? So for 1 action and a duration of 1 minute, you get the benefit of a intelligence, wisdom, or charisma-based skill with a +1 status bonus. In addition to this, you get a +1 status bonus to saves against curse, death, emotion, and fear effects. So a pretty decent range, if I'm going to be honest. And the bonus to skill checks is genuinely pretty good. Mostly, I'm sure this is going to be used for recalling knowledge in combat, but outside of combat, you got that focus point. You're doing some kind of investigation. Pretty easy drop, if you ask me. So for a singular focus point, pretty good. And this does heighten to some pretty great effects. Getting to a +2 at 4th rank and a +3 at 8th rank. That's a pretty solid bonus for whenever you need to make a recall knowledge check, typically. But there are some situations like doing intimidations in combat or Bon Mot or some other kind of feat, that these skills can be beneficial to you and your party. And as well, Perception is technically a wisdom skill, and thus this can be great for perception checks as well. So I really do like this one. It has a lot of good narrative purpose, but this isn't the most combat savvy focus spell. There is a better one for combat a little bit later, but just know that if you're getting into the Rivethun Emissary, you're going to be doing a lot of talking and a lot of other kind of mental skill stuff. So this is for a very particular kind of character. And while I think it's really good, I think there's a lot of really interesting narrative bits to it. And this can be a really cool character. Not just anyone could pick up the Rivethun Emissary. But there's some really cool feats here, and let's go ahead and get talking about them. So the first feat here on this list is Emissary Familiar. So Emissary Familiar gives you essentially a amped up familiar that has 2 additional familiar abilities. One must be the unique Synchronized Spirit Master ability. Now, if you already have a familiar, then you get Enhanced Familiar. But if the wording of this is to be read correctly, that means if you have a base level familiar, you not only get the effects of Enhanced Familiar, but an additional 2 familiar abilities. Because if you didn't have a familiar, then the second bit of text here wouldn't make sense. So this just gives any familiar essentially 2 free familiar abilities. Now, even if we were to take the guaranteed Synchronized Spirit ability out of the equation for the sake of like getting a unique familiar, that's still really, really good. And I should also mention at this point as well that you get, in addition to all the feats of the Emissary, you get the Enhanced Familiar feat and the Incredible Familiar feat as additional feats as well. So this is technically a familiar-based archetype because you can use these archetype feats for familiar abilities, whether your class gives you one or if you're using free archetype, which I recommend everyone does, is a really good way to get a pretty good familiar for not using your class slots. So honestly, I think this is really cool, but what makes it even better is the familiar ability, which you probably already read at this point. So Synchronized Spirit allows you to, once per round, sustain, which I don't know what that means because it's not an ability, but whatever. You take the sustain action and you synchronize with your spirit, becoming part spirit yourself. Any spells you cast or strikes you make, as long as they don't have a duration and they do their damage instantly, can have all their damage converted to spirit damage, which is amazing for spells like Fireball that might be not so good against like a demon you're up against, but hey, turn that into a spirit ball and boom, you now have the ability to damage them pretty easily, even if they have fire resistance. And if you're a martial character, one action to give yourself spirit strikes, which can be really good as there are a lot of creatures out there with some kind of physical resistance. So this is actually a pretty insane ability, and all it costs you is one action to do so every round. So I think this is a really good familiar ability, and this is on top of the fact that you get a familiar if you didn't have one, and it has an additional other ability besides Synchronized Spirit, more than like a base familiar would, or an enhanced familiar with another 2 abilities on top. It's really powerful. So I definitely wouldn't recommend overlooking this feat, especially because a lot of the additional feats do kind of lean into the familiar abilities, but this is not all that the Emissary really has to offer. Domain Spirit does somewhat answer some of my problems with the basic Bond with Spirit ability. It allows you to spend 24 hours to bond with either a creature, again it states creature, but it should probably be a spirit, or the very terrain itself. And then you can have one domain spirit that you are bonded to no matter the distance or amount of time. And you only lose this if it's an intelligence creature, which I didn't actually mention this, by the way, but whatever creature you bond with can sever the connection at any time. I mean, I feel like that's something that's kind of obvious, but that is a thing. So any intelligent creature that you bond with, which again, creature, can sever this bond. So I guess don't piss off whatever spirit or entity you are currently bonding with. or I guess don't piss off the lands, you know. There's probably some ways to do that. Anyway, this bond gives you the benefit of having a bond that you don't need to constantly maintain or remake. But in addition to this, you gain a domain spell, a initiate domain spell more specifically. So no matter what entity you make, or I guess terrain you make a bond with, you always have access to the healing or soul domains. But if the spirit is a creature, you can select from the ambition, confidence, family, might, protection, or trickery domains. And if the spirit is a terrain, which I guess infers that there is a terrain spirit, I don't know. Again, a lot of the wording here is very vague. You select your domain from the following: air, cities, darkness, earth, nature, travel, water, or wood. Now, there's a lot more text here. And most of what this text is talking about is, one, you gain the initiate or the initial domain spell, but the GM can also remove some of the prior mentioned options or add to the prior mentioned options based specifically on the type of domain that the creature is like related to. For instance, if you're making a deal with some kind of fire elemental, then the GM could remove water from the domains and give you instead fire. So there are a lot of different options here, and this is very flexible. This actually is really cool because it gives the player and the GM an opportunity to kind of barter with, you know, maybe the player wants to get a specific domain, and so they attempt to make a bond with a specific type of creature. Maybe they bond with the terrain of a graveyard. Who knows? Like, there's a lot of really interesting things you could do. And I do really, really like this. And I'm also a sucker for domain spells. And I'll make special mention that if you pick up this feat in particular, you get another focus point. So if you're already a class that uses focus points, by level 6, you could easily have all 3 of the focus points you need for any of your abilities. Any of your class that doesn't, you'll already have 2 for use with either Intreat with Spirit or whatever domain you get from your domain spirits. Now, if you do wish to change whatever spirit you're currently bonded with as your domain spirit, then you need to go through the same process, takes 24 hours, and you instantly, the second you start this process, you instantly lose the benefits of your prior domain, losing that domain spell temporarily until you get either the same domain spell or a new domain spell based on whatever entity you're now making a new bond with. And I will make another special mention as well. This one does state that you need to make this domain spirit bond with a creature which you have already bonded with using the bond with spirit ability. Now, that is a little bit of annoyance because in most practical situations, if a domain spirit is what you're after, then you're going to be like, hey, can I form a bond with you? And you do the process in 10 minutes. You're like, hey, can I make it a more powerful bond? And, you know, if they're willing, or if the land is willing, I guess, then you just add an extra 10 minutes onto a 24-hour process. So I get it. The whole thing is about consent and building trust and all kinds of narrative bits. I understand, but I'm a GM, and so many of the things I look at from a player's perspective, and players are oftentimes just looking to shortcut stuff like this. So, you know, not that they don't want to have the story bits, but when they're in need of power, they want to get to that power as quickly as possible. So, you know, I do like this. And again, all the way up until this point, up to level 6, we have so many options for all kinds of role play potential, all kinds of bonding with spirits. I can see like the witch being really, really good as a Rivethun emissary, especially with the Pact Broker Witch, the new one added in this book, which I'll talk about in a later video. So there's just a lot of opportunity for all kinds of roleplay stuff. And I'll let you guys know now, even though this bit has taken probably a half an hour or close to half an hour at this point, this is the most complicated and the most wordy that this particular archetype really gets. So we're through the hard parts. Now the rest of the feats are a lot easier. At 8th level, we have the option to pick up Kaleidoscopic Entreaty, and what this one does is actually enhances our Intreat with Spirit focus spell. Yeah, this is a very unique spell shape because it's a spell shape specifically for the use of a very specific focus spell. So a spell shape that essentially makes our Intreat with Spirit 2 actions rather than 1 action. Hopefully the benefit is good, and I would say it is. So when you use this spell shape, you kind of create a dazzling display and a 10-foot emanation around you when you use Intreat with Spirit. So not only are you going to get a special benefit to, one of your mental-based skills and maybe get a bit of resistance or a bonus to your saves for any negative effects that the enemy might do, either a curse or something like that. But you get to dazzle a bunch of enemies around you, needing to make a fortitude save against your Rivethun Emissary spell DC or your class DC, whichever's higher, which I'm really glad they give this option because honestly, I don't think your Rivethun Emissary DC really increases. So unless you're already a spellcaster, you're mostly going to be relying on your class DC at this point. And the fact that this could blind a creature for a round and dazzle them for a minute on a crit failure makes this pretty good. Am I going to say, yeah, this makes Intreat Spirit really good in combat? Not really. But if you're going to do so anyway, or if you just manage to find yourself surrounded by enemies, it's not bad. Now, it does say creature, not enemy. So you do have to be careful. You can blind your allies with this ability. So, tell them to avert their gaze, I guess. But this is a pretty solid ability, especially if you're a martial, because this gives you a ability to hinder the enemy's ability to hit you in melee combat if you just happen to find yourself surrounded. Especially because even on success, this will dazzle the creatures at least for 1 round. So that's pretty solid. And on failure, being dazzled for a minute is incredibly rough. So I'm going to say that this is a pretty good one. Kaleidoscopic Entreaty is a pretty decent feat, if you ask me. Also at level 8, we have Rivethun Devotion. This gives you 2 second-rank divine spells that you can use as innate spells once per day. See the Unseen and Spirit Link. Now this is generally pretty handy, and you get to heighten Spirit Link if you go up in proficiency with your religion. If you get to Master in your religion, you heighten Spirit Link up to 3rd rank, and if you get Legendary in religion, you heighten it up to 4th rank. Unfortunately, we don't get to have the higher level See the Unseen where we can just have it for longer, but both of these spells are kind of useful. Honestly, a little bit on the more situational side, if you ask me personally, with Spirit Link being a little bit more frequently used depending on what kind of build you're going with. But I would say if we were comparing this to the other level 8 feat, the Kaleidoscopic Entreaty, I would say that one is probably a little bit better than this one. But if you like having a little bit of extra spell casting in your kit, and for some spells that really don't require you to have a really good save or a spell attack or anything like that, these are some not bad spells to add to your repertoire. So I think this is also pretty handy, but probably something I would use only if I was doing a free archetype game rather than like a standard game. At 10th level, we get Advanced Domain Spirit, which, guess what, gives us the Advanced Domain spell of the spirit we're using. And I didn't mention this before, but when we get that Domain Spirit, this gives you the option to kind of have the ability to change what your domain spell is. It's very difficult, oftentimes requiring retraining to learn new feats in general, and domain spells typically are in that feat line. So if you want to learn a new domain spell, typically you have to retrain whatever feat is giving you that domain spell. This gives you the option to do so by just making a new bond. Now, granted, that's a 24-hour process, and narratively could be a little bit of a sketchy situation. You don't want to be seen as a floozy amongst the other Rivethun emissaries, but I do like the idea that depending on your journey, you can entreat with the spirit of the land itself to suit the needs of your current adventure, whatever you're currently doing. And that is pretty cool. And the fact that now we can get up to the advanced domain, and the fact that we could essentially retrain what would be 2 feats for just a 24-hour activity is pretty good, honestly speaking. So Along with all the really cool narrative elements mentioned with the Domain Spirit before, this gives us a little bit more, well, oomph with that connection. And I wanted to make mention of the variability it can provide your character as well, as maybe you can even swap up what your Domain Spirit is giving you depending on the day. Who knows? There's a lot of narrative bits that can really change how these mechanics work. And that's kind of a big thing with Paizo, is many of their archetypes are in either like the narratively powerful or mechanically powerful kind of categories. And I think Rivethun Emissary is more in the narrative camp. So mechanically, it might not be able to do as much as it's going to be able to do narratively for your campaign. Just something to keep in mind, but the fact that we get the advanced domain spells is genuinely pretty good. Now, level 12, we actually get one of our more potent abilities, but again, another more narratively based one, and I do have a little bit of problem with how long it takes. So we get Consult the Spirits. Now, Consult the Spirits is really good because it allows you to consult the spirits, which can be very handy because you essentially commune with the spirits of the world itself to give you some kind of hint or clue or guidance on events to come. This is very much like augury in some ways. You mention some event and the spirits give you kind of a hint of something you might need to keep track of, or you can ask the spirits of the world to concise questions that they can answer. Now, if the questions are easy for the spirits to answer, they will answer them clearly. But if they're hard, they tend to be more cryptic and more vague. So, and if you are just asking for general guidance, they do tend to be a little bit more on the vague side as well. No matter what kind of question you ask, though, you get a +1 status bonus to a skill of the GM's choice based on what the spirits think would be helpful for you for that day, which is kind of cool. And that can be an indirect hint from the GM on things to come. So I like this because it gives the players some meta knowledge on things to come, but in a way that is not good enough to necessarily foil a GM's plans, but to give the players the right nudge in the right direction, which is an excellent tool. I absolutely love this. The part I don't love is this takes an hour to consult the spirits in this way. Now, in a lot of situations, I can see this not really being a problem. You are on your adventure, you got some breathing room, you know something's up, and you're like, hey, I want to see if I can like consult with the spirits about this. And your party's like, yeah, sure, go ahead, wait, we can wait an hour, it's fine. But having the rest of your group wait an hour can lead to a lot of problems I've found in my personal experience. And unless it's a situation where waiting is beneficial to everyone else, you might get some players who get a little restless in that time, narratively speaking. I know there's a lot of situations where time is just kind of fake in TTRPGs. And so people are just like, yeah, we wait an hour. Boop, it's been an hour. No one actually had to wait that amount of time. But narratively speaking, I've seen it have some clashes with how certain players like to act. Now, this is really good if you know what you're going to be doing like ahead of time at the beginning of the day, because then you can just do this during essentially your daily preparations when it's not inconveniencing anyone. But oftentimes you're going to be mid-adventure, mid-doing something, and it's like, oh man, this ability would be really good, but we'd have to wait an hour for me to get this. And you're either not going to use the ability because that seems a little ludicrous to dedicate an hour just to get a +1 status bonus to a skill that we probably could just get with Intreat with Spirit anyway, or you do it and inconvenience the party, or you do it and it's not a big deal. So, you know, there's two of those three options are kind of problematic, but it doesn't have to be. I do like this one, and again, it's a lot of narrative flavor and the kind of answers you can get. Like a very smart player can use this to great degree. And that's why I said that the Emissary is very much a very good narrative class or archetype. It's going to be really good if you know what kind of questions asked, if you are getting really into the role play. And honestly, I could see the Rivethun Emissary leading to a broken character down the line. You make the right kind of pact with the right kind of spirit. The GM throws some extra fun stuff at you. Maybe you get an uncommon or rare domain you get access to, or maybe they just give you extra spell casting because the spirit is that strong. You know, there's a lot of very interesting ways that this can kind of go off the rails in a good way. So that being said, I think this is good. And despite my grievance with the hour, cast time, essentially, I just wanted to make clear that I think this works very, very well in a lot of games. But, user and GM beware. There's a reason why the Rivethun Emissary is an uncommon archetype after all. Next up, we have Manifold Conduit, another level 12 feat, and this gives us another focus spell. This one is Entreat the Many, and all the spirits you've bonded with up until this point erupt around you in a vortex of spiritual energy and a 10-foot emanation, dealing 8d8 force damage to each enemy creature in the area, so it doesn't hurt allies. Very, very good. With a basic fortitude saving throw. And any creatures that critically fail this check are automatically knocked prone while taking double damage. And this focus spell heightens every level for an additional d8. Now, this is already a 6th rank spell, so it's not going to get that much more powerful, but 8d8 force damage is pretty good even, as we pick it up. So yeah, a pretty decent attack focus spell that, could have some very big, narrative consequences. I mean, imagine you're entreating with a spirit of the land that's being corrupted by some tyrant, and now you get to utilize that spirit itself to damage and take back the land. It can be really, really cool. So not only is this mechanically good, it's also force damage, which is nigh unstoppable, but it can have some very powerful narrative elements, making this pretty much an ideal feat in my eyes. Next up, we have a Rivethun Adept, but there is a slight error with this one in the requirements. It says you need to be a Rivethun practitioner. I don't know if that means you need to have the dedication or you need to have Rivethun devotion. I'm assuming Rivethun devotion is what it's referring to because this is essentially the upgrade of that feat in particular. So you need to have Rivethun devotion as the requirement rather than practitioner. And this gives you 2 more divine spells. It gives you Spiritual Guardian, Spiritual Guardian, and Speak with Stone. Now, Speak with Stone is actually really, really good. If you know how to use it, Speak with Stone is actually really, really good narratively speaking. But Spiritual Guardian is insanely good, but something that's only good if you are a spellcaster. I mean, if you don't know, Spiritual Guardian, I'll just put it up here. Spiritual Guardian essentially just lets you have a 120-foot spell attack range on the battlefield. Pretty good. Or the ability to defend an ally and have a spirit just absorb 10 damage from an ally before all other damage. It's really good. It's a very powerful spell, honestly. And you don't need to have particularly good spellcasting to use the Guardian aspect of the Spiritual Guardian. Now, if you do get up to Legendary Religion, then the Spiritual Guardian gets up to 7th rank rather than 5th rank. But we get 2 more innate spells, which is pretty good, and something, honestly, that I think, these ones in particular, I think are really, really good. And so if you are going the route of wanting some spell casting, I would say picking up Devotion before getting to Adept is actually worth the extra feat pickup because these are both bangers of divine spells. And we essentially have the capstone feat left. But before we get to that point, I want to ask you guys too, if you're enjoying the content, leave a like. Now, that's not just for my video, but any other videos you're finding on TTRPGs out there, as we need to show people, we need to show the algorithm that people are interested in TTRPG content, and that means interacting with the algorithm. So leave a comment or leave a comment saying I'm a big doo-doo head, whatever you do, dislike the video, leave a nasty comment. It doesn't matter. If you like TTRPGs in any sense, I recommend doing it to all videos that you find at least a little bit interesting, because it really does help. And the more we show the algorithm that people like this kind of content, the more people are going to get shown this content. And that is my main goal with the channel. So, leave a like. But hey, if you do like my content, or you're a hater and you don't want to miss a video, then subscribe. I cover most Paizo books a week before they fully release, so you can get some of that, primo information here. In addition, I cover other tabletop content as well. So if you want a very well-rounded TTRPG channel that doesn't really cover Dungeons and Dragons, but pretty much everything else, then I recommend this channel for your subscription. Anyway, shilling aside, let's go ahead and get to the final feat of the Rivethun Emissary. The last feat is a bit of a doozy. It's called Emboldened with Glorious Purpose. I love the name, and it does a lot. Let me bring it up over here from my notes, because I need to have it front and center. It does a lot. So when you use Consult the Spirits, which is that feat I mentioned before that we got at level 12 that allows you to ask kind of a vague question or something, you get more out of it. So now you gain a +1 status bonus to will saving throws until the next time you make your daily preparations. And this bonus increases to +2 against any kind of emotion or fear effect. So you just embolden your mind as, speaking with the spirits is super cool and you get super jazzed and nothing can tear you down. I like the narrative implications for this. And I think there could be some very fun character quirks built around this particularly, though it's a level 18 feat. So this is not going to be something that you're going to be making a big part of your character unless you happen to be playing in a high level campaign, like a high level campaign. Regardless, pretty cool, but that's not where it ends. In addition, we get 3 boons that we can use once each. First, we can roll a will save twice and take the better results. We can roll an attack roll twice and take the better results. And hey, the last one is we can roll a skill check twice and take the better results, though this skill check must be the skill that the spirits gave us that they thought would be handy on our adventure. So the last one is kind of, depending on your character, may be good, may not be good, but the first 2, that's killer. So one ability, we get all this on top of another once per day feature that just buffs us. If we're going to consult the spirits anyway, this just happens when we do that. And so there's really no reason not to take this one, because Consult the Spirits, 1, can be narratively really handy and very useful, but 2, just getting a +1 status bonus on our will saves, just a bonus to will for the rest of the day, that's insanely powerful. You're going to want to talk to the spirits just for that. And the ability to roll 2 will saves or attack rolls is really good. And if we just happen to be a skill monkey, or the skill in question just happens to be one that we're particularly good at, getting to roll one of those twice and take the better result is also insanely good. So Emboldened with Glorious Purpose, not only having such a cool name for a feat, is also a genuinely pretty cool feat. So that's the Rivethun Emissary. This was a bit of a longer one because a lot of these feats kind of needed a little bit more talking about, and you can already see why. If I combined all of them, that would have made for an outrageously long video. This one is already pretty long, but hopefully I was able to provide some guidance for you if you decide you want to add this to your character and you want to talk to your GM about it. Heck, send this video to your GM if they're confused really on how this is supposed to work, and maybe this video can elucidate some of that. Granted, they're going to want to sit down for, a 50-minute video, but sorry, I talk a lot. This is a pretty cool archetype. I think this one is right up my alley. I'm a much more narratively focused player anyway, and many of the mechanical benefits are pretty good as well. And I do genuinely think that this could be used on many styles of characters. This is not a combat archetype. This is a narrative archetype. So if you have a very combat-focused character, this can really round out the narrative aspects of your character, making them have literal connections with the story. You could become very plot relevant with the Rivethun Emissary, and the religion itself is pretty cool, or the spiritual group, as I said before. Anyway, and now let's talk about the Rivethun Invoker. So the Rivethun Invoker is a archetype dedicated to a more martial play style. You're kind of taking the spiritual energy and pulling it within so that you can get greater benefits from the various, spiritual entities and all kinds of stuff. But you know what this actually archetype really reminds me of is Udyr from League of Legends. Now, you might not play League of Legends, and I wouldn't blame you. I played it a long time ago, and I haven't played it really all too much in the last few years. But Udyr was a character whose main thing was kind of like embodying different animals to get certain buffs. And a lot of that can be found here in the Rivethun Invoker. In fact, if you wanted to do a Udyr style build, you would have to take the Rivethun Invoker. Honestly, it's just that good. And this is a really good archetype for any characters who really want to go into a more brawlery, kind of bully style martial combat. In fact, I don't typically do this, but before we look at the dedication, let's look at the additional feats. So at 6th level, you can get barreling down and slam down. And slam down, if you're unfamiliar, was the old knockdown. So if you're a big Mauler fan, then this probably would look very familiar to you. Both of these really good. Barreling charge for, getting to an enemy and pushing everyone else out of the way, while slam down is just the de facto one of the best strikes in the game, where you get to strike and trip with the same multi-attack penalty. It's really, really good. And at 12th level, we get crashing slam and overpowering charge, the updated versions of these feats. So that being said, you can already tell that this is a very bruisery style of archetype, as these are the additional feats. Though, I would make special mention that since these are additional feats that you can pick up through this archetype, that means this makes it really good for other martials who don't get this, typically non-fighters, who want to add this. Like a monk can make good use out of a lot of these abilities, and so I think the Rivethun Invoker is really good. But let's go ahead and take a look at what unique things the Rivethun Invoker gives you. So starting off with the dedication, similar to the Emissary, which, by the way, if you don't know anything about the Rivethun Covenant, please check out my last video. I'll put a little thing up here in the corner so that you know, or so you can click it and go watch that. The whole beginning part is for the Covenant, and I call it religious or spiritual group a lot. Same thing, more or less. But what's important is that the whole aspect of Rivethun is communing with spirits. And for this particular dedication, you have to take these spirits into yourself to kind of amp up your abilities. So this archetype is uncommon like the Emissary, and it does require you have access, quote unquote, to being in a part of the Rivethun Covenant. Though, that's mostly a society play thing, so, for your home games, it's probably a little bit less of an issue. And unlike the Emissary, which is a lot more narratively focused and requires a lot more GM fiat, this one is uncommon, I guess, because it's particular to a region. Rarity is more of a Pathfinder society thing anyway, but yeah, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. This archetype is really good, don't get me wrong, but rarity was never a power gate in the first place. It's more of just like a narrative thing. So beyond that, you do need to be trained in both athletics and religion, similar to the Emissary, only this time with athletics rather than diplomacy. And also similarly to the Emissary, you get expert in both these skills. So for the Invoker, you get expert in religion and athletics. Pretty good. I already mentioned before in the prior video, which this is probably, you might be watching this when I've spliced all these videos together into one mega Rivethun video, but it's really, really good when an archetype gives you expert skill proficiencies. Even if it was just one, and this one gives you 2. Absolutely amazing. I really, really like this one. But the real kicker here is the Enter Spirit Trance. Now, this is a unique ability that you get to use, and it lasts for a minute. It's a singular action. And when you go into this trance, you gain a number of temporary hit points equal to your level plus your Constitution modifier. That's as good as Barbarian Rage, which is very solid. This, even early level, this can be very potent. So just that is already pretty good, but this trance is necessary for pretty much every other feat in this particular archetype. So you're going to be using this trance a lot. And even though it says trance, it's not a stance, which I don't know why you would confuse the two, but it's not a stance. So you could go into a stance while being in this trance. I'm done saying those two words together. That's getting a little confusing for me. In addition to the temp HP, you also get a +1 status bonus to your will saves and your fortitude saves. That's really, really good because it gives us a little bit of extra stat defense essentially, and it's just on top of the temp HP and the ability to use every other ability. And because this is not even a stance, then there's other things you can get into. Like this lasts for a minute. It lasts until you either dismiss it or fall unconscious, which that part really sucks because once you get out of this trance, then you can't get back into it for another minute. So this is pretty much a 1 per battle kind of ability. And of course, after a minute, this one also ends. So if you're doing back-to-back combats, that can also be a little bit rough. But I think for most practical use, this is a once per battle kind of ability. And if you do ever fall out of the stance, any remaining temporary hit points you have are gone. So, something to keep in mind. But yeah, so at base, this trance gives us temp HP and 2 +1 status bonuses to our saves. That's really, really good. And this allows us to use so many of the other really cool abilities in this particular archetype. So I gotta say, 2 expert proficiencies and the trance all together wrapped up is an insanely good dedication. And it's a level 2 dedication. That's a lot to get at level 2. So I am definitely going to say that the Rivethun Invoker is really, really good, and it gets only better. So the first feat we get is Invoke Offense. Get used to the word invoke because we're going to be using it a lot for these feats. And what's really cool about most of these feats is these are just essentially buffs, 1-action buffs. Like, there's many spells that do something similar that cost 2 actions and a spell slot. This just requires that you're in the trance, which requires no sustaining or anything like that. And you can just continuously buff yourself. I mean, it's really good. So Invoke Offense is one of the least impressive ones, if I'm going to be honest, but it's still really, really good. So what it gives you is an unarmed strike that does a D8 spirit damage, is agile, finesse, and magical. Now, why this is particularly good is because if an enemy has any kind of physical resistance or is maybe a ghost or something that is more vulnerable to spirit damage, then you can forego your weapon and get this unarmed strike. And the theming behind it is kind of cool as you take a spirit into yourself and it gets manifested as like a claw or a vine or something like that. Again, very reminiscent of Udyr from League of Legends. And what's even better about this one is it automatically essentially heightens. At 5th level, you get the benefits of the striking rune. At 12th level, you get greater striking. And at 20th level, you get major striking. Now, this is not necessarily that great because if you are kind of going all in on this particular unarmed attack, because it's pretty good, honestly. I mean, being a D8 agile finesse unarmed strike is incredibly powerful, actually, like trait-wise, and it's magical. So there's some enemies that have certain resistance to physical damage types or damage types in general from non-magical sources, and this bypasses that just for the sake of being magical. So this is a really good unarmed strike, but if you're going to, go all in on this, then you're going to probably get hand ups and mighty blows, so you can get more than just the basic property runes. So the extra bit is not necessarily great if this is going to be your main weapon, essentially, but this is insanely good if you're a martial character who's using another type of weapon. Maybe you're a fighter or something like that, and you come up against an enemy that's just very physically resistant, and you get to not automatically, but you get to use Invoke Offense to make a pretty decent weapon that you can use in that fight. And since the runes essentially heighten, it's pretty good. I also forgot, it wasn't a really big part of it, but when we go into our trance as well, all of our melee strikes do an additional spirit damage. It's not much, and 1 spirit damage, it doesn't scale like at all. I would have preferred if it was 1 spirit damage per weapon damage die. That would have felt at least a little bit better. But at the very least, we get to do a little bit of spirit damage with any weapon we're using, which means if we are fighting a creature that has a weakness to spirit damage, even if we're not using Invoke Offense, we are still able to trigger that weakness. Though most of the time, enemies that have a spear weakness are also incredibly resistant to physical damage, which means Invoke Offense is still pretty good to have, and it just becomes an extra tool in our kit. Though, it's also just an insanely good unarmed strike. I mean, again, Finesse Agile D8 is very strong, and topping that off with Magical, it's very good. So Invoke Offense is really good, but I would say one of the more situational feats here on this list. Now at level 6, we actually get a unique reaction called Leverage Anguish. This reaction can be used only once per day and is triggered whenever we take, let me take a look here. You fail or critically fail a saving throw against a curse, death, emotion, or fear effect. Are there any fear effects? I don't know if there's any fear effects that aren't technically emotional effects. I'm not going to look, but it seems kind of like already stated. Regardless, a pretty decent list. And what this does is actually gets us HP back when we fall under these effects, which is actually kind of cool because say we get demoralized, for instance, boom, reaction gets some HP back. So even if we are a little bit weakened due to being, frightened potentially, then at the very least, we get some extra HP to soak things up with. This is a pretty good feature, but most of the time I'm going to imagine it's going to be used to mitigate some of the damage you just took from potentially like a curse or a death effect, though hopefully we're not crit failing any death effects because usually that ends up in you just dying and the HP is not going to be useful anyway. And something I really like about this one is it seems to scale based off your character's general physicality, as the higher your athletic score is, the more HP we get back. So when we first pick up this particular feat, which our athletics will be expert at, we get to recover 2d8 hit points. And if we get to master proficiency, which could be the very next level, if you get a skill increase at 7th level, then you're going to get 4d8 HP back. And if you get to legendary in athletics, you're going to get 6d8 HP back, which is a pretty good amount. Now, this isn't amazing healing by any means, and this can only be used once per day, but this could just make a bad situation a little less terrible. So, honestly, pretty good. I think this one is generally good. Like, emotion effects and fear effects are some of the most common effects monsters use in the game, and if you're not playing a class that gets, like, Reactive Strike, for instance, and honestly, there's just a lot of situations where Reactive Strike won't come up, then honestly, this is not a bad pickup as it just gives you a little bit of extra sustain in a fight. I mean, even a barbarian would be insane with this one in particular, as they are really prone to just kind of getting hit by everything. And, having a barbarian that's even tankier sounds terrifying. So I really do like this one, but I'll make special mention that if you're a caster, this is potentially really, really good because they don't get reactions typically anyway. And so a reaction that can prevent you from kind of being overly fucked in a situation is kind of good. So this one is very applicable to both marshals and casters, but I feel like casters can get a little bit of a bonus out of this one. Now, the next feat we're going to talk about is the absolute, it should be the reason you pick up this dedication in the first place. This feat is insanely good. It's called Invoke Defense, and what it gives you is really, really good. So for a singular action, you get a physical resistance against one of the 3 physical damage types, slashing, bludgeoning, or piercing. And this resistance equals half your level. Now, why this is really good is there's really no stipulation other than the fact that you need to be in your trance in order to get this benefit. But you need to be in your trance to get all these benefits anyway, but the thing is, getting resistance, especially resistance equal to half your level against a physical damage type, is one of the most difficult things to do in Pathfinder, unless your class just gives it to you. Some classes do give it to you, but not to this amount. This is really good, and you can always spend an action to change the damage type if another damage type becomes more prevalent in a fight. So, this is really good. This is insanely additional tankiness that you can just add, and all it costs you is essentially an additional action. Maybe, if you're going to be a little pedantic about it, it's going to be 2 actions to go into your trance in the first place and then get this benefit. but the trance gives us so many really good benefits anyway that it's good enough to go into for itself. And this is just really, really good to do in addition to that. And when you really consider it, imagine it's 2 actions, right? Imagine you're just focused on, I know some people really get all hung up on, it's 2 actions to get blah, blah. 2 actions, essentially a spell that gives you level plus con temp HP, +1 status to fortitude and will saves, 1 extra spirit damage on all your strikes, and the ability to use all the other invokes, but in this case, Invoke Defense, which gives you just half your level in resistance. That's better than most spells in the game. So I gotta say, Invoke Defense is insanely good. And it's very, very good, especially late game, because many enemies start doing multiple damage types. They do a lot of damage, mind you, but they start doing multiple damage types. So this gives you the ability to resist some of that damage, which does really become necessary, especially if you're not a particularly tanky class. So Invoke Defense is insanely good. And if anyone was to go into the Rivethun Invoker, you need to pick this feat up because it's just that good. It's just, I can't understate how good this feat is. Now, I absolutely love this next feat, mostly because I did this for an NPC in one of my games, and it's called Defy Sorrow. It's another reaction based on failing or crit failing a mental effect. In addition, this also works if you are dealt any kind of mental damage or spirit damage. So there's a lot of triggers for this particular reaction, but what it does is absolutely insane because it makes you quickened for your next turn, and you can use either the stride or strike action. And what's even more insane is that unlike Leverage Anguish, Defy Sorrow doesn't have a once per day limit. So this one can be used anytime you have a reaction and you take one of the triggers. So just getting quickened very easily is a really good feature. Now, granted, mental effects and or spirit damage or mental damage, like spirit damage and mental damage, are not super common, depending on the kind of campaign you're in. But mental effects are somewhat common. Granted, this only works if you fail a mental effect, which typically sucks. But this can be really good because now you're just getting a little bit of extra action economy on your next turn, which can very much turn the tide of a battle. So I gotta say, Defy Sorrow is really good too. Like, not as good as Invoke Defense, but it's pretty up there. The next one is Invoke Movement, and this is just better than even the Fly spell, okay? Like, I gotta say, the Rivethun Invoker is legitimately an incredibly powerful archetype. Like, no joke, there's so much here that's just straight up better. Like, all you need to do is get into the trance initially, which is a pretty decent buff. And then you can just use a bunch of 1-action spells that last for the duration of the trance, which is a minute, which is most combats. And this one allows you to get either a burrow, climb, fly, or swim speed equal to your base speed. Now, this is base speed, though there are a variety of things that alter your base speed, but I do need to make mention that this does just do your base speed. So anything that buffs your speeds, make sure you look at them because they might only boost like your movement speed rather than giving you a boost to your other types of movement. Just something to keep in mind. And if you do choose the burrow speed, it's technically half your speed. So, you know, there's also that to consider, but it's a burrow speed. Burrowing is actually insanely powerful. So even half your speed is probably going to be more than enough. And yeah, you just get this and you can just spend an action to change what movement this gives you, which means that like a caster has to spend 2 actions that gives himself flights that also uses a spell slot. And you can do that for 1 action and you can just decide, I would prefer to have a climb speed because actually moving vertically, depending on if there's a surface nearby, is faster with climbing than it is flying. And similarly, you can't fly underwater. So, you know, take that, casters. Now, of course, fly eventually is able to be used on multiple people, and that's really powerful in itself. But if we're looking at base flight, this kicks its ass way out of the water. Now, it's a level 12 feat, and base flight is a 4th rank spell. So, you know, we're kind of comparing apples to oranges here, but I'm trying to emphasize to you all how powerful this ability is, and it just can be activated anytime we're in our trance. So even narratively speaking, or if we're talking about exploration, you can just decide to get flight for a minute, and then you can fly for a minute, which can get you pretty much anywhere you need to go immediately anyway. And then it only has a 1-minute cooldown once you're done with the trance before you can do it again. That's really good. Now, it's not as crazy as Kineticist's ability to just get flight forever, but it's pretty close. So I do really, really like Invoke Movement. It's a really, really good feat, and it just makes this particular archetype, again, insanely good. And if you're a martial character, you absolutely know how infuriating it is to fight flying enemies. And now that's not a problem, because now you can fly too for just a singular action. So yeah, this archetype's really, really good. I'm genuinely surprised this archetype is this good, because I've seen so many other restrictions and balancing put into other archetypes, and this gives a lot of benefit to martial characters who already are like balanced around the fact that they don't have the same versatility that a lot of other classes have. So that being said, yeah, Invoker's really, really good. There's nothing else to say. It's an insanely good archetype. And we're not even done, because we have a final feat at level 16 called One with Spirits. This one can only be used once per hour, and like all the other feats, require that we are in our trance in order to use it. But this one's pretty good. I wouldn't say it's necessarily as good as like Invoke Defense or Invoke Movement, but it's pretty solid, and it makes your character have way more survivability. First of all, it gives you fast healing 5. So every turn, you just get 5 HP back. So a really good thing to activate pretty early on in a fight, at least after you've taken your first bit of damage, as that 5 HP is going to stack up essentially multiplicatively with the number of rounds in the combat. So you're looking at typically between 15 and 25 HP extra that combat. And I'll make mention, in addition to the temp HP we're getting, which is at this level 16 plus our con modifier, which is probably either 3 or plus 4, for a total of 19 or 20 extra temp HP, and an additional 15 to 25 just extra straight HP. So really good, though I will make mention that due to that temp HP, this does kind of lose a little bit of its effectiveness, because unless an enemy breaks through all the HP in the first round, which is quite possible at this level, you might get a little bit less use out of that fast healing. You know what is really good and is worth wasting the healing? You just become concealed. Just concealed while you're in your trance, as long as you're using One with Spirits, which does have a factor that does cause it to, turn off, but we'll get to that here in a moment. But yeah, you get concealed. And that's really good, because the enemies just get a flat check to miss you, which is technically also giving you extra HP by grace of the enemy doing less damage to you. So this is just a tank's wet dream of an ability that you only need to use one action. Granted, it's once per hour, which does limit some of its usability in a dungeon. You might use it once or twice per dungeon, and the effects can only last up to a minute. Though, if you're doing like some kind of travel, and like overworld travel or something like that, and you take some damage in a fight, heck, that's 50 HP for a singular action. You just go into the trance and then use this, boom, bunch of HP after a minute. And that's a pretty good like self-heal out of combat. Not the best. And this is a game that obviously has a lot of, free healing, though that's a lot of healing in a minute, which a lot of the other healing in the game is more based on the 10-minute timer. And the good stuff doesn't stop there. So now your strikes automatically are considered to be using the Ghost Touch property rune, which is also really, really good if you're ever fighting spirits or anything like that. And anytime you strike, you can choose to have all the damage of that strike become spirit damage, which means Invoke Offense is really not super necessary at least at this point in the game. Granted, it was probably really handy up until level 16, so I'm not saying you don't need that feat, but I'm saying that now at this point, we don't need to rely on Invoke Offense if we ever come up to those situations anymore, which means if you're not using free archetype, which I mean, I guess if you're crazy, you can retrain out of Invoke Offense for another level 4 feat. And we're still not done, because while we're under the effects of One with the Spirits, if we would ever become knocked unconscious or have our dying value increase, which I don't know when you would have your dying value increase while not being unconscious. Maybe you guys can let me know in the comments below a situation where that might happen, because there's many feats in the game that increase your wounded level rather than going down, but not dying level or dying value, which is a very different thing. But anyway, the spirits revive you at the beginning of your next turn and heal you for 30 hit points. Though this does cause One with Spirits to then end immediately. So we're no longer getting the benefits of our, fast healing and all the other really cool things, but we don't die, which is probably well worth it. And the additional 30 HP is probably more benefit than you're going to get from your fast healing in the fight anyway. So that being said, it's pretty good. This archetype is really good because any character that picks it up becomes way tankier and has some decent offensive capabilities. Now, I will make, a special mention that this is a very defensive archetype, but survivability just means that your overall damage potential is higher because you're, not spending time getting up from being knocked unconscious. So that being said, it has a lot of combat value, which makes it insanely good for a combat character. And the fact that it comes with 4 additional feats, some of which are some of the best feats fighter has, I can see that this is a really, really good archetype that has a really cool flavor to it too. You take in a spirit and you can use that energy. It almost has a very chi kind of feeling to it, which is kind of cool. So that is the Rivethun Invoker. It's really good. I don't think I need to say much more than that. It's pretty self-evident at this point. It's probably the strongest of the 3 archetypes, I'm not going to lie, but that's okay because it also does not have near the flavor of the Emissary. And we still have the Involutionist, which again, I still don't know what that word means. I'll learn it by next video and I'll tell you all what it means. I still don't think I know what it means even after looking up the description. So I'm gonna give you the Wikipedia article here, and my base assumption is it's like a pre-evolution where the soul gets enough mass before it descends to the material plane and begins the process of evolution. It's evolution and cosmology kind of wrapped into a singular concept. It fits the general Rivethun idea of a spirit kind of descending to the material plane and becoming a physical creature at that point. And while that's not necessarily a Rivethun ideal, it is kind of what this is describing. So I'm not the most educated on this particular subject, so don't quote me on any of this. Look it up yourself, but that's roughly the idea, is kind of the process, the round is what it was called, of a soul joining the evolutionary process. It matches the kind of spiritual tone and it's very esoteric. So, they could just come up with their own word and I would have been just as happy with it. So I'm not too pressed about it, but yeah, that's what involutionist means. But this archetype is interesting. Well, okay, so this archetype fills a very specific niche. If you like spell casting and animal companions, then this is going to be the only archetype you're going to want to pick up. But if you want one or the other, you're probably better off looking somewhere else. I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but first let's go ahead and look at the dedication. So the dedication is like every other Rivethun archetype so far. You need 2 skill proficiencies, one of which needs to be religion, and this one needs nature. And when you get this dedication, you get expert proficiency in both of these skills. That's really good. I've said this in the other videos, but that's really good. Expert proficiencies in an archetype dedication are really hard to come by, and you get 2 in this particular archetype. Other than that, you just get the basic, like, whenever you do a multi-class archetype into a spellcaster, benefits. So for this one, you get trained in divine spells and divine spell attack rolls and DCs, and you get 2 cantrips to add to your repertoire. So it's repertoire casting. I know how many of you love that kind of stuff, and that's kind of it. That there's not anything unique or special here, and this particular archetype is just that. It doesn't really give us anything new. It just does it in a way that's new as far as archetypes are concerned. I do want to make mention that this is an uncommon archetype, even though I have no idea why it would be uncommon, other than the fact that you need to be a part of the Rivethun Covenant to gain access to this. But those are mostly, Pathfinder Society problems. So if you're not in Pathfinder Society, not a big deal. But if you are, this is only uncommon, which I know is a little cheaper to get. And the Rivethun Covenant is honestly not that bad. Just something to keep in mind before we kind of get into it. Before we get to the animal companion part, I want to make mention that the first feat here on the list is the basic Rivethun spellcasting. It just gives you basic spellcasting. That's it. You get divine spells, which, by the way, I don't think I mentioned before, but you use wisdom as your key ability modifier for it. Not too bad in particular, but it's just basic spellcasting. Now, the next feat, though, is a little bit interesting because we get access to a spirit companion. Now, the spirit companion doesn't have any passive features, but instead, it's a young animal companion. And with this young animal companion, you get it becomes blessed by the spirit, which means you can use a sustain action to give it the ability to do only spirit damage with its attacks, at least until the beginning of your next turn. So you get an animal companion that is good against enemies that have a lot of physical resistance, or enemies that might have a spiritual weakness. Honestly, not too bad. My only real gripe with this one is the extra action costs. You do need to sustain it in order to get this benefit, and it only lasts until the start of your next turn. And that's not including the fact that you actually need to command your animal companion in the first place. So I'm not a big fan of that. Honestly, how I would do it is I would make it where, as a part of commanding an animal, you can sustain this to give them spirit damage, or just make it where your animal companion can do spirit damage if that damage would be more beneficial. I think there's no reason to add extra action load, especially because the whole point of an animal companion is the action efficiency. You get 2 actions essentially for 1 command and animal action, which is pretty good. So the extra action cost kind of just wastes some of the potential of the animal companion. So, use my homebrew if you feel that would be better, or if you think this is balanced, then you're lucky. That's how it's written. There you go. Like, the way I play my game doesn't affect that at all. I think it's interesting. I do think it's genuinely interesting, but if your animal companion just did spirit damage whenever it was more beneficial, I don't think that would break the balance of the game. But, that's just from my personal opinion. And that's pretty much the archetype dedication. Kind of. So that's the rest of the archetype dedication is these 2 features. You get both expert spellcasting and master spellcasting benefits. Just a singular sentence for each of these feats. Like, I'm put them both here so you can see. And you get them when you would through a multi-class archetype dedication. So there's really nothing special here other than the fact that this archetype gives you both spellcasting benefits and animal companion feats all in one archetype, so you don't have to do a bunch of multi-class archetyping. It is more efficient, and it's for a very specific style of character. Now, you get additional feats. In fact, the first feat in this particular archetype that's unique, quote unquote, isn't until level 12. Other than that, you fill the rest of the space with the additional feats where you can get the mature animal companion and the incredible animal companion. Though, I will make special mention that this archetype is a little bit unique because you can get a specialization ability for your animal companion at level 14, which is earlier than like a ranger would get a specialized animal companion. Though, when you select this feat, you must choose the Spirit Blessed specialization. What the Spirit Blessed specialization does is gives your animal companion the property of Ghost Touch. That's it. Nothing else. It's a very like bog standard kind of specialization that's just it's useful, and you can select this feat multiple times to get the other specializations. But yeah, like, okay, so this archetype dedication gives the animal companion a lot of coverage for its major weaknesses. Animal companions don't do really well with enemies that are very damage resistant, or, well, physical damage resistant anyway, or against things like ghosts. And this gives the animal companion the ability to attack ghosts, granted at level 14, which is a little late, though the spirit damage will probably be very effective against ghosts, I should say, or to just, you know, it just lets you damage very tough enemies. It's a very, like, it's very basic. This whole archetype is very basic, but it's the only archetype you should use if you want both of these features. Like, imagine this, right? Imagine you're a fighter and you're playing with free archetype because it's really fun and I really recommend it. And you want some extra spell casting to kind of give your character a little bit more diversity and an animal companion. I mean, it's really cool. The idea, like the idea of a fighter who can cast divine spells and has an animal companion is pretty good. And this is very feat efficient to do that. In fact, this whole archetype isn't really, there's no competing feats really. Like, sure, at level 4, you have to pick between spellcasting or an animal companion first. But, I mean, that's not such a big deal considering that there's no other feats, unless we're including the additional feats, until level 12. And even if you select those additional feats, you can get the other one at 6th and the other one at 10th and then 12th. Or, sorry, 8th, 10th, and 12th. Or the one they have in 12th. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. It's just, I don't know what to say. Like, this particular archetype just gives you things we've already seen before. It's interesting and unique, but this just fills a very specific niche, hence the thumbnail for this video. Unless you're watching the long form video, in which case, yeah, it's just basic. It's the only place you can get these two sets of feats together at once, which makes it kind of cool. I think this one's very interesting. If I had one major gripe, well, besides the whole sustain thing, it's compared to the other Rivethun feats, this is just not that interesting. Like, it's not, there's not a lot of story stuff. There's not cool mechanics to play with. This is just a unique combination of two sets of feats in one. But if you wanted one side of this, like animal companions or just spellcasting, you're way better off just selecting a different archetype, Beastmaster, or like a multi-class spellcasting archetype, because at least then you could get, you know, more feats based on that type of playstyle. So this is the only archetype that offers both of these options at such an efficient way, in such an efficient way. But if you want just one side of this, you're going to want something else. I don't think that's bad. In fact, I think it's really good. As I mentioned before, the whole fighter idea is pretty interesting, and you can tap onto pretty much any character concept. And as long as you're playing free archetype, I mean, that's a lot of good use. So, you know, I think this is a really good archetype, but, you know, maybe that's just me. Let me know down in the comments below. That's the Rivethun archetypes. I really enjoyed this line. I really enjoyed all these feats, and I'll be sewing all these videos together for one cohesive video for those who like to just sit down and listen to my voice for over an hour. You're insane, but I'm going to enable you in your insanity. So, enjoy. Many people wanted it, and so that's what I'm going to do. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the battle luck to me, and I'll see you in the 1 hour video. Bye.